The moment I understood what my parents had actually done, I was standing in my grandmother's kitchen holding a piece of paper that should not have existed. It was a deed. It had my grandmother's signature at the bottom, and my grandmother had never signed it. I knew that because she was sitting 3 feet away from me in her favorite chair, looking at that same paper with eyes that had gone completely still. She was not crying. She was not yelling. She was just quiet in that deep old way that only comes when someone you raised does something you cannot fully process. I had been covering for my parents my whole life. I had been making excuses, explaining them to neighbors, softening their edges for everyone who asked. But there was no softening this. There was no explanation I could give my grandmother that would make a forged signature on her home look like a misunderstanding. My name is Ackles, and this is the story of the day I stopped protecting the people who were never protecting her. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something real. If you found out that someone in your own family had forged an elderly person's name to take their home, and that elderly person was someone you loved, what would you do? Would you try to fix it quietly to protect the family image? Would you go straight to the law? Would you feel torn between loyalty and justice the way I did? Drop your answer in the comments, because by the end of this story you are going to see exactly what I chose, and I want to know if you would have done the same thing. My grandmother's name was Celestine, but nobody called her that except strangers and the people at her bank. Everyone who loved her called her Gran. She had lived in the same house for 41 years. It was a modest house on a quiet street in a mid-sized city in Georgia, the kind of house that holds more memories than square footage. The floors creaked in the same 3 spots they always had. The kitchen smelled like something was always about to be cooked even when nothing was on the stove. The back porch had a swing that Gran had sat on almost every evening of her adult life. That house was not just a property. It was the physical center of everything our family called home. I grew up going to that house every week. My parents, Douglas and Renata, lived about 20 minutes away, and Gran was close enough to be part of our daily life when things were good and close enough to be used when things were not. I say that now with clarity. When I was younger, I thought my parents simply loved Gran the way everyone did. I thought the visits and the favors and the borrowing of her car and the long dinners at her table were just family. I did not yet understand that there are people in this world who love a person and also quietly catalog everything that person owns. I am the oldest of 2 children. My brother Donnie is 4 years younger than me and has always been the one who floated. That is the only word I have for it. Donnie floated through school, floated through jobs, floated through relationships, and floated through consequences. My parents floated with him when it suited them and blamed me for not floating when I tried to stay grounded. I was the one who graduated on time, got a job, paid my bills, saved money carefully, and showed up for every family obligation whether I was invited warmly or not. I was reliable in the way that gets taken for granted. I was there in the way that becomes invisible. By the time I was 29, I was working as an operations coordinator for a mid-sized logistics company. It was not glamorous work, but it was good work. I was good at it. I had my own apartment, a small savings account I was proud of, and a clear head about where my life was going. My parents at that point were in their mid-50s and had been cycling through financial trouble for most of my adult memory. My father Douglas had started and closed several small businesses over the years. My mother Renata worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a few local businesses, but her hours were always changing. Together they moved money around constantly, borrowed here, delayed there, promised later, and somehow always landed on their feet just enough to keep going. Gran was 79 at the time all of this happened. She was still sharp. I want to make that clear because it matters enormously to this story. She was not confused. She was not forgetful in any serious way. She had some arthritis that slowed her hands and she tired more easily than she used to, but her mind was clear and her opinions were precise and she knew exactly what she owned. She owned that house outright. She had paid it off years before my parents' financial struggles began. That house had no mortgage. It was hers completely. And she had told me more than once that she planned to leave it to me and Donnie equally when she was gone. She had a will. She had shown it to me. She was organized in the way that people who grew up with very little tend to be, because they know that what you have must be protected carefully. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a phone call I received on a Tuesday afternoon in March. It was Gran calling, which was not unusual. We talked on the phone often, sometimes just for a few minutes, sometimes for an hour. But this call felt different from the first sentence. She asked me if I knew where my parents had gone. I told her I did not, that I had not spoken to them in about 2 weeks, which was not unusual either. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told me that they had come to visit her 3 weeks before, that they had stayed for 5 days, that they had been very attentive and helpful, and that during that visit they had asked her to sign some papers. She said she had signed some things without reading them carefully because Douglas had told her it was just insurance paperwork to make sure she was protected as she got older. She said she had trusted him because he was her son-in-law and she had known him for 30 years. I felt something shift in my chest when she said that. I asked her what kind of papers. She said she was not entirely sure, but that she had a copy somewhere and that she had been looking at it and it did not look like insurance paperwork. I told her I was coming over. I drove to her house that same afternoon. When I walked in, Gran had the papers spread out on her kitchen table. She had her reading glasses on and she was looking at the documents with that same careful stillness I would see again weeks later. I sat down across from her and I looked at the papers. It took me about 4 minutes to understand what I was reading. The document was a quitclaim deed. For anyone who does not know what that is, a quitclaim deed is a legal document that transfers ownership of a property from one person to another. It is commonly used between family members or in situations where ownership is being simplified. It does not guarantee title the way a full sale does, but it is legally binding when signed properly. The deed in front of me transferred ownership of Gran's house from Celestine to Douglas and Renata. My parents' names were on the receiving line. Gran's signature was at the bottom. Gran looked at me from across the table and said she did not remember signing anything that said the word deed. She said Douglas had told her the papers were about a supplemental insurance policy for elderly homeowners and that she needed to sign to protect herself. She had trusted him. She had signed. I took photographs of every page of that document on my phone. I asked Gran if she had anything else, any other papers from that visit, any receipts or letters or anything at all. She brought me a small folder she kept by the phone. Inside was a notarized acknowledgement that matched the deed. Someone had notarized Gran's signature, which meant either Gran had signed in front of a notary and truly did not understand what she was signing, or someone had managed to get the notarization done fraudulently. Either way, it was deeply wrong. I asked Gran if she had gone anywhere during that 5-day visit, to any office, to any notary, to any government building. She thought about it for a long moment and then she said yes. One afternoon Douglas had taken her to run errands. She said she remembered sitting in an office for a few minutes and signing some things on a clipboard. She said she had assumed it was medical paperwork for her doctor's office. She had not read it carefully because her eyes were tired and Douglas had said it was routine. My parents had taken my 79-year-old grandmother to a notary and had her sign a quitclaim deed on her own home while telling her it was something else entirely. That is elder fraud. That is forgery in intent if not in literal signature. That is the kind of thing that puts people in prison. I stayed calm in front of Gran because she needed me calm. I made her tea. I sat with her for 3 more hours. I did not tell her yet the full weight of what I thought had happened because I wanted to be sure before I said words that could not be taken back. I told her I was going to look into it and that she should not worry and that I was going to handle it. She trusted me the same way she had trusted Douglas, but I was going to earn that trust differently. When I got back to my car that evening, I called my parents' phone. No answer. I called twice more. No answer. I sent a text that said simply, "Call me when you can, it is important." No response that night. The next morning I started making calls. I contacted a real estate attorney whose office I found through a referral from a coworker. I explained the situation in general terms and asked for a consultation. They could see me 2 days later. I also called the county property records office and asked about the deed. They confirmed that a deed had been recorded. The transfer was on file. It had been recorded. At about 10 days after my parents' visit to Gran, which meant they had moved quickly. They had filed it before Gran could figure out what had happened. I also searched online for my parents and I found something that made my stomach go cold. About a week after the deed was recorded, my parents had applied for a home equity line of credit using Gran's house as collateral. They had not yet been approved, but the application was in. They were trying to borrow money against a house that was not legally theirs, using a transfer they had obtained through deception. And now I could not reach them. The day before my attorney consultation, I drove to my parents' house. Their car was in the driveway. I knocked, no answer. I knocked again and called out that it was me, Ackles, still no answer. I stood on that porch for a moment and then I noticed the mailbox was overflowing. There were several days of mail jammed in there. I could see through the front window that the lights inside were off. I checked with a neighbor who lived 2 houses down, a woman named Mrs. Petty who had known my parents for years. She told me she had not seen them in about 2 weeks. She said she thought they might have gone on a trip because she had seen them loading bags into a car late at night about 12 days ago. My parents had recorded the deed, started a loan application on Gran's house, and then left. They had not said a word to me. They had not said a word to Gran. They had just gone. I met with the attorney 2 days later. Her name was Patricia Voss and she had been practicing real estate and elder law for over 20 years. I showed her the photographs of the deed and the notarized acknowledgement. I explained the timeline. I explained what Gran had told me about being told the documents were insurance paperwork. I explained the overflowing mailbox, the empty house, and the pending loan application. Patricia Voss listened to everything carefully and then she said a few things that I wrote down because I needed to remember them exactly. She said that what I was describing, if true, constituted elder financial abuse. She said the deed itself might be voidable depending on what could be proven about the circumstances of signing. She said the fact that Gran was competent made the fraud angle stronger, not weaker, because it showed that someone had deliberately deceived a competent person rather than simply taking advantage of someone who lacked capacity. She said the notarization was a critical point, and that if Gran had been deceived about what she was signing, the notarization did not validate the deception. She said I needed to get Gran to a doctor immediately to have her cognitive state formally assessed and documented, not because there was any question about her sharpness, but because having that documentation on record would be important for any legal proceeding. She also said I should file a report with Adult Protective Services and consider filing a report with the County District Attorney's Office. I did all of those things within the following week. Gran's doctor confirmed what anyone who knew her already understood. She was mentally competent, oriented, and clear. The assessment was thorough and the documentation was clean. I also hired Patricia Voss formally to begin reviewing the deed for legal challenge. She filed a lease pendens on the property, which is a legal notice that essentially freezes the property's status and tells anyone looking at it that there is an active legal dispute. That stopped the equity line application from moving forward. Through all of this, I still had no word from my parents. No call, no text, no email, nothing. I began to understand that they had not simply gone on a trip. I began to understand that they had fled. It took me until the following month to confirm it through a combination of a social media post from one of Renata's old friends and a phone call I made to my mother's sister, my Aunt Cora, who lived in Florida. Aunt Cora was not happy to hear from me, but she was also not a liar when pushed directly. She told me after considerable pressure that Renata had called her from Costa Rica. They had relocated. She did not know when or if they were coming back. My parents had forged my grandmother's effective consent, taken her house, attempted to borrow against it, and then moved to Costa Rica. I sat with that reality for a long time. I had to. Because the anger that came with it was enormous and I could not act from anger. I had learned that about myself over the years. When I act from anger, I make noise, and noise does not build anything. I needed to be clear, I needed to be precise, and I needed to protect Gran. I moved into Gran's house. Not permanently, not at first, but I went there every evening after work and I spent weekends there, and eventually I just brought enough things to stay most nights. Gran needed company and she needed someone watching the house, and I needed to be close to her. We fell into a quiet rhythm. I would cook, she would tell stories. We would sit on the back porch in the evenings and she would talk about my grandfather and about the early years in that house and about what it had meant to build something that lasted. One evening she looked at me across the porch swing and said, "You know what the saddest part of all of this is?" I said, "No." She said, "It is not the house. I can fight for the house. The saddest part is that I thought I had raised someone who knew the difference between what is yours and what is not." I held her hand and I did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would make that better. I stayed in contact with Patricia Voss regularly. She had filed the necessary paperwork to begin a formal legal challenge to the deed transfer. The grounds were undue influence, fraud, and elder financial abuse. She told me that even if my parents were in another country, the property was in Georgia and Georgia courts had jurisdiction over it. My parents could not simply take ownership of a Georgia property by moving abroad. The property still existed here. The legal process still applied here. About 6 weeks after Gran and I had first looked at those papers together, my brother Donnie finally surfaced. He called me from a number I did not recognize. When I picked up and heard his voice, I felt something complicated. Donnie was not a bad person at his core. He was weak and inconsistent, and he had spent his whole life choosing the path with the least resistance. But I did not think he was cruel. I did not know yet where he stood in all of this. He told me he had heard from Mom and Dad. I asked him where they were. He confirmed Costa Rica. I asked him if he had known about the deed before it happened. There was a pause that lasted a little too long, and then he said he had known something was going on but that he had not known the exact details. I asked him what that meant. He said Mom and Dad had told him they were getting some things sorted with Gran's estate planning and that it would be better for everyone in the long run. He said they had told him Gran had agreed to it. I told him Gran had not agreed to it. I told him Gran had been told she was signing insurance paperwork. I told him what the deed actually said and what they had actually done. There was a very long silence on the phone. Then Donnie said, "Are you serious?" And the way he said it, the genuine shock in his voice, I believed him. He had not known the full truth. He had been kept just informed enough to be used as passive support and not informed enough to object. I told him what was happening legally. I told him about Patricia Voss, the lease pendens, the Adult Protective Services report, the district attorney inquiry that was now open. He said he did not know it had gone this far. I said it went this far the moment they filed the deed. I told him that if he wanted to help, the most useful thing he could do was document everything he knew about conversations with our parents regarding Gran's house and to not interfere with the legal process in any way. He said he would. I did not know if he would hold to that, but I had to be direct. Donnie called me again 2 days later. He had something. He said that during one of the conversations he had with my father in the months before the deed was filed, Douglas had said something that Donnie had written in a text response at the time. The text exchange was still in Donnie's phone. In the text, Douglas had described his plan as leveraging the house as an asset before things got too complicated. He had also mentioned that Gran was not getting any younger and that it was better to move things into position now than to wait for the estate process. Donnie sent me screenshots of those texts. I forwarded them to Patricia Voss immediately. Those texts were significant. They showed premeditation. They showed that Douglas had been planning this move in advance and that he had framed it to Donnie as a calculated financial strategy rather than an estate planning agreement. Patricia Voss called the texts very useful when I sent them to her. She added them to the legal file. The equity line application had been denied once the lease pendens was recorded, which meant my parents had not managed to borrow any money against the house before the freeze went into effect. That was important. It meant the house itself was intact. It meant we were fighting for something that was still there. About 2 months into the process, I received a call from an unknown international number. I almost did not answer it. When I did, I heard my mother's voice, Renata's voice. She sounded careful, not apologetic. Careful, there is a difference. An apologetic person starts with "I am so sorry." A careful person starts with "We need to talk." She said that she had heard things had become complicated back home. I told her complicated was one word for it. She said that she and Douglas had made some decisions that were maybe not explained well, and that she hoped we could figure out a way to resolve things without involving lawyers and courts. I told her lawyers and courts were already involved and had been for several weeks. She said she did not want things to go that way. I told her that she had made that decision when she recorded the deed. She shifted then. She said that Gran had agreed to help them and that there was a misunderstanding about the paperwork. I told her Gran had told me exactly what she had been told when she signed and that it did not match what the paperwork actually said. Renata said Gran sometimes got confused. I told her Gran had a formal cognitive assessment on file and that it confirmed she was competent and clear. That silenced her for a moment, then she tried something different. She said she and Douglas were in a very difficult financial situation. She said they had debts I did not know about and that they had been desperate. She said they had not had any other options. She said that family was supposed to help each other and that Gran would have wanted to help if she had understood the full picture. I told her that if Gran had wanted to help, she would have done it in a way that was honest. I told her what they had done was not a favor between family. It was fraud against an old woman who trusted them. She started crying on the phone. I want to be honest about how that felt because I think it matters. It felt like standing in a rainstorm and refusing to open an umbrella, not because I was not wet, but because I knew that if I opened the umbrella, she would think the rain had worked. She cried and told me she was scared and that they were in a bad place and that she needed me to understand. I told her I understood more than she thought. I told her I understood that she and Douglas had been planning this for months, and that they had left immediately after filing the deed and that they had not called me or Gran once until now. I told her what I needed her to understand was that the legal process was moving forward and that if she and Douglas wanted to reduce the consequences, they needed to contact Patricia Voss directly. I gave her the attorney's contact information. I said there was nothing else for us to discuss. I ended the call. I sat in Gran's kitchen after that call for a long time. I made myself a cup of coffee I did not drink. Gran was asleep in her room. The house was quiet. I thought about everything that had led to that conversation and everything that might still come from it. I thought about how Renata had not once in that entire call said the word sorry to Gran. She had said she was sorry things had gotten complicated. She had said she was in a difficult situation. She had not said I am sorry for what I did to your grandmother. That told me everything. Patricia Voss received contact from a Costa Rica-based attorney representing my parents about 2 weeks after that phone call. My parents were clearly not entirely without resources because they had managed to retain legal counsel internationally. The attorney sent a letter that was long on legal language and short on substance. It suggested that the deed transfer had been a valid estate planning measure made with Gran's full knowledge and that the family dispute was a misunderstanding that could be resolved through mediation. Patricia Voss responded with the documentation we had. Gran's formal cognitive assessment, the statement Gran had given about what she had been told when signing, the timeline showing the deed had been recorded and a loan application filed in rapid succession, and Donnie's text screenshots showing Douglas had planned the transfer strategically. The response from their attorney went quiet for about 10 days. During that waiting period, 2 things happened that added new dimensions to the situation. The first was that the county district attorney's office officially opened a criminal investigation into the matter. An investigator called me to set up a formal interview. I met with her, a calm and methodical woman named Investigator Brenda Cho, and I gave her everything I had. The photographs of the documents, Gran's account, Donnie's text, the timeline of the deed filing and loan application. She also interviewed Gran separately. Gran was precise and composed during her interview. She told Investigator Cho exactly what she had been told when she signed, exactly what visit she had made during the 5-day stay, and exactly what she remembered. Gran's clarity was her own protection and mine, and she delivered it without drama. The second thing that happened was that a woman named Louise, who lived on Gran's street and had been Gran's neighbor for 22 years, came to the door one afternoon. She told me that she had seen Douglas and Renata loading things from Gran's house into their car during that 5-day visit 3 months earlier. She said she had seen them carry out 2 cardboard boxes and what looked like a flat item wrap. In brown paper. Gran and I went through the house carefully that evening. We found that 2 things were missing: a collection of silver serving pieces that had belonged to Gran's mother and a small framed oil painting that Gran's late husband had bought for her on their anniversary trip to New Orleans. Neither of those items had been mentioned anywhere in the paperwork. They had simply been taken, I informed Patricia Voss. She added the information to the civil file. I also called Investigator Cho and gave her Louise's name and contact information. Louise agreed to give a formal statement. 3 weeks later, my parents' international attorney sent a new letter. This one had a different tone. It acknowledged that there may have been some procedural irregularities in how the deed transfer was executed. It proposed that in exchange for the civil case being dropped, my parents would agree to sign a corrective deed returning the property to Gran. It also proposed a mediated settlement for the personal property. Patricia Voss and I discussed this at length. The offer was interesting but incomplete. Returning the property was necessary, but it was not sufficient on its own for two reasons. First, the criminal investigation was not mine to drop. That was the district attorney's matter, and it was moving independently. Second, a corrective deed on its own did not address the full harm that had been done, which included the failed loan application that had damaged Gran's credit standing and the emotional toll of the whole situation on a 79-year-old woman who had done nothing wrong. Patricia Voss wrote back with our counterposition. We would not oppose the corrective deed, and we would provide documentation to the civil court that the property dispute was being resolved, but we could not make any representations about the criminal investigation because it was not ours to control. We also requested formal acknowledgement of the personal property that had been removed and documentation of what had happened to it. The response to that took 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, the criminal investigation continued moving forward. Investigator Cho called me to let me know that she was in contact with relevant authorities in Costa Rica through international cooperation channels. She could not share details, but she told me the investigation was progressing. Gran and I kept our rhythm during all of this. She was remarkable to me. She was not falling apart. She was angry in the way that dignified people get angry, quietly and with tremendous precision. She told me once that she was not afraid of the outcome. She said she had been building her life for too long to let two scared people undo it with a piece of paper. She said the house was hers not because of any document, but because she had lived it. She said documents could be corrected, but the years inside those walls could not be taken. I wrote that down in my journal that night. The corrective deed arrived from my parents' attorney, signed by both Douglas and Renata about 5 weeks after the counterposition letter. Patricia Voss reviewed it carefully. It was properly executed, and it returned full ownership of the property to Gran. We filed it with the county, and it was recorded. The lease pendens was removed. Gran's name was back on her house. I was standing with Gran at the kitchen table when Patricia Voss called to confirm the recording had gone through. Gran held the phone with both hands and listened and said thank you in a voice that was very quiet. After she hung up, she put the phone on the table and looked at her hands for a moment. Then she said, "All right." I said, "All right." We did not say anything else for a while, and we did not need to. The personal property question resolved about 2 months after that. My parents, through their attorney, acknowledged that the silver serving pieces and the framed painting had been taken during the visit and claimed they had intended to hold them for safekeeping, which was not a story that made any sense given the context. They offered to return the items. The painting was returned via a shipping service, professionally packed. It arrived undamaged. The silver serving pieces were returned separately. Both arrived. Gran inspected each piece carefully and confirmed they were all there. The criminal investigation took considerably longer. I want to be honest that not everything in a legal process resolves on a clean timeline. What I can tell you is that the investigation remained open and active for several months, and that during that time my parents' ability to do certain things internationally was impacted in ways I cannot fully detail. What I can say is that the formal acknowledgement of elder financial abuse in the civil context created a documented record that had weight. About 8 months after the corrective deed was filed, my parents returned to the United States. I do not know the exact circumstances of their return. I do not know if it was fully voluntary or if there were pressures I was not informed of. What I know is that they came back, and that when they came back they were facing the open criminal investigation. They did not call me when they returned. The first I heard they were back was from Donnie, who told me they had arrived and were staying temporarily with a cousin on my father's side. Donnie sounded exhausted on the phone when he told me. He said he did not know what was going to happen to them. I told him I did not know either. I told him that was the consequence of what they had chosen. About 3 weeks after they returned, my father called me. It was a Sunday evening. I was at Gran's house sitting on the back porch. I looked at the screen when the call came in, and I thought about not answering. Then I answered because I had decided long before that moment that I was not going to spend my life avoiding the truth, even when the truth was painful. He said my name when I picked up. Just Ackles. His voice sounded older than I remembered. I said Douglas. I did not call him Dad, not because I was performing anything, just because the word did not fit the moment. He asked how I was. I told him I was fine. He asked how Gran was. I told him Gran was well and that she was in her house. He was quiet for a moment after that. Then he said, "I know I have done things that cannot be undone." I said, "Go ahead." He said he was sorry. He said he had been in a desperate place, and that he had told himself that Gran was old and that the house would come to the family eventually, and that he had just been moving things forward, and that he had not thought through what he was doing to Gran or to me. He said there was a lot more he could say, but that he knew words were probably not worth much right now. I listened to all of that. I let him finish. Then I said, "I appreciate that you said it. I want you to know that I am not carrying hatred for you." I do not have room for hatred in my life, but I also need you to understand that what you did to Gran was not just a financial mistake. You stood in her kitchen for 5 days, you sat at her table, you let her feed you, and then you took her to sign papers she did not understand and you filed those papers and then you left the country. That was a choice made over many days and many decisions, and I cannot pretend that an apology makes it simple. He said he understood. I said, I hope you do. I told him that Gran was not someone I was going to use as a bargaining piece. I told him that if he wanted a relationship with her going forward, that was between him and Gran. I was not going to broker it and I was not going to stand in the way of it. I told him Gran was her own person and she would make her own decisions about forgiveness and contact. He said he understood that too. I did not ask him about the criminal investigation because it was not mine to manage on his behalf. I did not offer advice. I did not try to soften the road ahead for him. I simply told him the truth of what I saw and what I felt and what I expected. When we hung up, I sat on the porch for a long time listening to the neighborhood sounds and feeling something that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but something steadier than either. I went inside and found Gran in the kitchen making herself a cup of tea. I sat down at the table and she handed me a cup without asking if I wanted one because she always knew. I told her Douglas had called. She looked at me over the rim of her cup and said, and I told her he had said he was sorry. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, I will decide what to do with that on my own time. I said, I know. She said, thank you for not making that decision for me. I said, this is your house and your life and I would never make your decisions for you. She smiled at that, just a small smile, and said, you are a good one, Ackles, you always have been. I held my cup with both hands and I did not say anything because some things are better held quietly. In the weeks that followed, Gran did eventually speak to Douglas on the phone. I was not there for that conversation. She did not tell me everything that was said. She told me only that she had said what she needed to say and that she had heard what he said and that she was going to take her time with what came next. I told her that sounded right. She agreed. Renata reached out to me by text about a month after Douglas's call. Her message was longer than I expected. It covered a lot of the same ground as my phone call with Douglas, but it also went further. She said she had spent months in Costa Rica thinking about who she had become and that she did not like what she saw. She said she had grown up watching my grandfather be honest and straightforward, and she had always respected that, and she did not know when or how she had lost that value for herself. She said she was in therapy for the first time in her life. She said she was not asking me to trust her or to pretend anything had been erased. She said she just needed to say it to someone who would not dismiss it. I read that text 3 times. Then I wrote back. I told her that I heard her. I told her I was glad she was in therapy. I told her I was not ready for a full relationship, but I was willing to leave the door not entirely closed. She wrote back one word, okay, and that was where we left it. Patricia Voss closed the civil case formally about 10 months after it had opened. Everything that needed to be returned had been returned. Everything that needed to be documented had been documented. Gran's house was completely clear. The criminal matter was still working through its process and Patricia Voss was not involved in that side. I received updates from investigator Cho periodically, but the details were not mine to share publicly. My parents faced real consequences, not from me, not because I engineered a punishment, but because what they had done was serious, and the systems that exist to protect people like Gran responded to that seriousness. I had filed the reports I was supposed to file. I had protected Gran the way she deserved to be protected. The rest was the legal process doing what it was designed to do. I want to talk about what happened to me during that year because the story is not just about the house and the legal process. The story is about who I became through it. Before all of this started, I had a habit of explaining my parents to people. When someone asked about them at a family event or a work conversation, I would find a way to make them seem more stable and more reasonable than they were. I had been doing it for so long that I did not even notice I was doing it. It was automatic. It was how I had survived growing up in a house where things were always slightly unstable, and where I was always the one expected to hold the emotional center steady. The year of the house made that habit impossible to maintain. I could not explain away a forged deed. I could not soften elder financial abuse with good framing. The truth was too large and too specific to be managed with careful wording. And when I stopped trying to manage it, something unexpected happened. I felt lighter. Not happy exactly, not at first, but lighter. Like I had been carrying a structure in my chest for 30 years that had finally been put down. I also realized during that year how much of my energy had been spent on the wrong direction. I had spent so much time and emotional resources maintaining the appearance of a functional family that I had not been fully available for the people who were actually there for me. My coworkers who had quietly supported me during the hardest weeks. My closest friend, a woman named Tamsin who had come to Gran's house with food twice without being asked. Gran herself who needed simple presence more than she needed solving. I began paying attention differently after that year. I began noticing who showed up without being asked. I began understanding that reliability was a form of love and that I had been giving it to people who treated it as a resource to be extracted rather than a gift to be honored. I stopped making myself smaller so that the people around me could feel larger, not in a dramatic way, just quietly and with increasing intention. Gran's house went through a small renovation that year. Nothing major, just some repairs that had been deferred and a fresh coat of paint on the back porch which badly needed it. I organized the work. Donnie helped on 2 of the weekends, which surprised me in a good way. He was not spectacular at home repair, but he was there and he was trying. I had decided to let Donnie be Donnie, which meant letting him show up imperfectly without punishing him for not being more. He had not participated in the fraud. He had been used as a passive observer the same way people like Donnie usually are, given just enough information to feel included and not enough to object. He was working through his own complicated feelings about our parents, and I was not going to add to that weight. By the end of that year, Gran and I were closer than we had ever been. We talked about real things. We talked about her life and my life and what we both wanted. She told me she had updated her will with a proper estate attorney, someone she had chosen herself, and met with herself without any family present. She told me she felt good about it and that everything was in order. I did not ask what it said. It was not my business until it needed to be. She told me once that she had thought about selling the house after everything that had happened. She said the idea had crossed her mind because sometimes a place gets stained by what happened inside it. But she said she had walked through every room and sat in every chair and stood in the kitchen where she had cooked 10,000 meals, and she had decided that the house was more of what it always had been than it was of what had nearly happened. To it, she said it was still home. She said home was worth protecting. I agreed with her. Home was worth protecting, not just the physical structure, the feeling of safety inside it. The feeling that what you built with your life and your hands and your years was yours and could not be taken from you by someone who mistook your kindness for permission. That is what my parents had mistaken. They had seen Gran's trust in her generosity and her love for family, and they had decided that those things were access. They were not. They were gifts freely given that had been repaid with theft. And when the theft was undone, what remained was what had always been there. A woman of 79 years with clear eyes and strong opinions and a back porch swing, and a daughter by love if not by blood who sat beside her in the evenings and did not need anything from her except her company. I think about that image sometimes when the world feels tangled. I think about Gran on the swing and the sound of the neighborhood settling into evening and the way she would look out at her yard with something that was not quite peace and not quite victory, but something more useful than either. Continuation. She had continued. The house had continued. And I had become someone I was proud to be inside it. One more thing I want to say about the whole of that year. There is a version of this story where I am the hero and my parents are the villains and everything is clean and satisfying, but real life does not sort that neatly. My parents were people who had made very bad choices under financial pressure and moral failure. They were not strangers. They were not monsters from the start. They were people I had loved and admired at different points in my life, and people who had clearly lost themselves somewhere along the way in a combination of debt and desperation, and the terrible human tendency to tell yourself that what you want to do is not as bad as it actually is. I do not forgive them on a clean schedule. I do not have a tidy answer for where we all stand. What I have is Gran's house standing secure in its county record, Gran's name on the deed, Gran's things back on her shelves, and Gran's back porch swing still making that same sound it always made when the evening wind comes through. What I have is a clear sense of what I will and will not accept. What I have is the knowledge that I protected someone who mattered more than the peace of being the good, quiet daughter who does not make waves. I made waves. They were necessary. And when the water settled, the house was still there. If you stayed with Ackles through this whole story, I want to ask you one final question before you go. Has there ever been a moment in your life when you had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting someone you loved? When staying quiet would have been easier, but you knew deep down that easy was not right. That is the line Ackles stood at, and she crossed it. Tell me in the comments what you would have done differently or what this story brought up for you. And if you know someone who is dealing with a family situation that feels too big to handle alone, share this video with them. Sometimes the most important thing is knowing that someone else has stood in that same impossible place and found a way through.